A mountain man living alone in the Rockies took in an orphaned 7-year-old girl after a deadly blizzard, and behind the stone wall of his cabin, he'd been hiding $280 million that powerful men had killed to protect for over 3 decades. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind howled through the pines like a living thing, ancient and angry, carrying snow that cut like glass across the face of the Rocky Mountains. November had come early to the high country, and with it, the kind of storm that turned roads into ribbons of ice and made even the most experienced drivers second-guess their journey. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in just 3 hours, and the sky had turned the color of old bruises, heavy with the promise of worse to come. Jacob Hayes stood on the porch of his cabin, a structure he'd built with his own hands 12 years ago, and watched the storm roll in from the west. He was 47 years old, though the mountain had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. His beard was thick and streaked with grey, his hands scarred and calloused from a lifetime of work, and his eyes carried the kind of stillness that came from spending more time with silence than with people. He wore a flannel shirt over thermal layers, jeans worn soft with age, and boots that had been resoled twice. Everything about him suggested a man who had chosen solitude not as an escape, but as a necessity. The cabin sat at 9,000 feet, tucked into a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. It was a 2-room structure with a steep metal roof designed to shed snow, thick log walls chinked with a mixture he'd perfected over years of trial and error, and windows small enough to hold heat but large enough to let in light. A stone chimney rose from the center, and smoke curled from it now, grey against the darkening sky. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of coffee and venison stew filled the air. Jacob had built this life deliberately. The nearest town, Ridgeline, was 18 miles down a winding mountain road that became impassable for weeks at a time during winter. He made the trip once a month for supplies, paid cash, spoke little, and returned to the mountain before anyone could ask too many questions. The locals knew him only as the man who lived up on Hayes Ridge, though few could say with certainty what he did up there or who he'd been before. Some said he was a veteran, broken by war. Others whispered he'd lost a family and couldn't bear to live among people anymore. A few thought he was just another drifter who'd run out of places to run. They were all wrong, but Jacob never corrected them. Anonymity was its own kind of armor, and he'd learned long ago that the less people knew about you, the safer you were. He took a final sip of his coffee, the mug warm against his palms, and turned to go inside. The storm would hit hard tonight, and he needed to secure the woodpile, check the generator, and make sure the shutters were latched. He'd weathered dozens of storms in this cabin, maybe hundreds, and each one followed the same ritual. Preparation, patience, survival. But this storm would be different. This storm would bring him something he'd never expected, something that would crack open the life he'd so carefully constructed and force him to become someone he'd thought he'd left behind forever. It started with a sound. At first, Jacob thought it was just the wind, the way it sometimes screamed through the canyon and rattled the trees. But then he heard it again, sharper this time, more deliberate. Metal on metal, the groan of something heavy shifting, and then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a car horn, steady and desperate, echoing up from the road below. Jacob's blood went cold. The road that wound up to his cabin was treacherous in good weather. In a storm like this, it was a death trap. Switchbacks with no guardrails, sheer drops into darkness, and ice that formed faster than you could react. He'd warned people about it, the few times anyone had been foolish enough to try. But tonight, someone had ignored the warnings. He grabbed his heavy coat, pulled on his gloves, and slung a coil of rope over his shoulder. He took a headlamp from the hook by the door and strapped it to his forehead, then grabbed his first aid kit and a wool blanket. His movements were automatic, efficient, the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years preparing for emergencies. He didn't allow himself to think about what he might find. That would come later. The snow was already falling hard as he stepped off the porch, thick flakes that swirled in the beam of his headlamp and clung to his beard. The temperature had dropped further, and his breath came out in white clouds. He moved quickly, following the sound of the horn down the narrow trail that connected his cabin to the main road. The trees closed in around him, branches heavy with snow, and the wind tore at his coat like it wanted to drag him back. It took him 20 minutes to reach the wreckage. The car had gone off the road at one of the worst possible spots, a hairpin turn with a steep embankment on one side and a drop-off on the other. It had clipped the embankment, spun out, and rolled at least twice before slamming into a cluster of pines 30 feet down the slope. The horn was still blaring, a mechanical scream that cut through the storm. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, and one headlight flickered weakly, casting strange shadows across the snow. Jacob scrambled down the slope, grabbing onto branches to keep from sliding. His boots sank into the snow, and twice he nearly lost his footing, but he didn't slow down. When he reached the car, he could see the damage. The driver's side was crushed, the windshield shattered, and the roof had caved in near the back. It was a sedan, mid-sized, not built for mountain roads. The kind of car you rented when you didn't know any better. He pulled open the passenger door, and the horn finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The driver was a man in his 30s, slumped over the wheel, his neck bent at an angle that told Jacob everything he needed to know. The woman in the passenger seat had gone through the windshield, her body half in, half out, snow already beginning to cover her. Jacob checked for pulses anyway, his fingers numb even through the gloves. Nothing. They'd died on impact, or close enough that it didn't matter. But then he heard it, a small sound, barely audible over the wind. A whimper. Jacob's head snapped toward the back seat and his breath caught. There was a child. She was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, strapped into a booster seat that had probably saved her life. Her coat was pink, her hair dark and tangled, and her face was pale in the beam of his headlamp. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow, and her eyes were wide with shock and terror. She stared at him like he was a ghost, or maybe like she was. "Hey," Jacob said softly, keeping his voice calm even as his mind raced. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" The girl didn't respond, just kept staring. Her breathing was shallow, too fast, and her lips were starting to turn blue. Hypothermia. She'd been out here for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer, and the cold was already working its way into her bones. Jacob reached in carefully, checking her for injuries. The cut on her forehead was superficial, and she didn't seem to have any broken bones, but she was shaking violently, her small body racked with shivers. He needed to get her warm, and he needed to do it now. "I'm going to unbuckle you, okay?" he said, keeping his tone steady. "We need to get you out of here. I've got a place nearby. It's warm. You're going to be safe." He didn't wait for a response. He reached across her and unclipped the booster seat, then carefully lifted her out of the car. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made his chest tighten. He wrapped the wool blanket around her and pulled her close to his chest, trying to share his body heat. She didn't resist, didn't make a sound, just pressed her face against his coat and held on. Jacob looked back at the wreckage one more time. He couldn't help the parents now, and he couldn't call for help. His cabin didn't have cell service, and the storm had knocked out the landline hours ago. The road was already impassable, and by morning it would be buried under 3 feet of snow. The authorities would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was the girl. He started back up the slope, moving as quickly as he dared with the child in his arms. The wind fought him every step, and the snow was coming down so hard he could barely see 5 feet in front of him. But he knew this mountain like he knew his own heartbeat. He'd walked these trails in every season, in every kind of weather, and he could find his way home blind if he had to. By the time he reached the cabin, his arms were burning and his lungs felt like they were full of ice. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside, the warmth hitting him like a wall. He carried the girl straight to the fire and set her down gently on the rug, then stripped off her wet coat and shoes. Her socks were soaked through, and her hands were like ice. "Stay with me," he said, rubbing her hands between his to get the blood flowing. "Come on, sweetheart. Stay with me. He grabbed dry clothes from his dresser, thermal underwear and a thick wool sweater that would swallow her whole, and helped her into them. She didn't fight him, didn't speak, just let him move her like a doll. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, and Jacob recognized the look. Shock. Trauma. The kind that shut the mind down to protect itself. He wrapped her in another blanket and pulled her closer to the fire, then filled a mug with warm water and held it to her lips. Drink this. Slow sips. That's it. She drank, her hands shaking so badly that he had to hold the mug steady. When she finished, he set it aside and just sat with her, letting the fire do its work. Slowly, the color started to come back to her cheeks. Her breathing evened out. The shaking subsided. But she still didn't speak. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Responsibility, not for himself, not for survival, but for someone else. This child, whoever she was, had just lost everything. Her parents were gone. Her life as she knew it was over, and she was sitting in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in clothes 3 sizes too big, staring into a fire like it held the answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "My name's Jacob," he said quietly. "You're safe here. I promise." The girl didn't respond. She just pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Jacob stayed beside her for the rest of the night, feeding the fire, checking her pulse, and watching for signs of concussion or worse. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wreckage, the bodies, the look on her face when she realized she was alone. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a blanket of white. The sun rose pale and distant, casting long shadows across the snow. Jacob stood on the porch, his breath fogging in the cold, and stared down at the road. It would be days before anyone could get through, maybe a week. He turned back to the cabin, where the girl was still sleeping by the fire, and felt the weight of what came next settle onto his shoulders. He wasn't a father. He'd never been good with kids. He'd spent the last 12 years avoiding people altogether, and now he was responsible for a traumatized child who'd just watched her parents die. But there was no one else, not yet. So Jacob did the only thing he could do. He went back inside, closed the door behind him, and started figuring out how to keep her alive. When the girl finally woke, it was late morning. Jacob was at the stove, heating up a can of soup, when he heard her stir. He turned to find her sitting up, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Hey," he said gently, "how are you feeling?" She didn't answer, just looked around the cabin like she was trying to figure out where she was. "You're at my place," Jacob explained, keeping his voice low and calm. "Up in the mountains. There was an accident last night. Do you remember?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded once, slowly, and looked down at her hands. Jacob poured the soup into a bowl and brought it over to her. "You need to eat something. Can you do that for me?" She took the bowl without a word and sipped it slowly. Jacob sat across from her, giving her space, not pushing. He'd dealt with trauma before, in another life, and he knew that sometimes the best thing you could do was just be present. After a while, she set the bowl down and looked at him. Her voice, when it finally came, was small and hoarse. "Where are my parents?" Jacob's chest tightened. He'd been dreading this question, rehearsing answers in his head, but nothing felt right. How do you tell a child that her whole world just ended? "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "They didn't make it. The accident was bad. They didn't suffer." It was a lie, but a kind one. The girl stared at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded again, just once, and looked away. Jacob waited for tears, for questions, for anger, but she gave him none of it. She just sat there, small and still, wrapped in a blanket that dragged on the floor, and stared into the fire like she was trying to disappear into it. "What's your name?" Jacob asked after a while. "Lily?" she whispered. "Lily," he repeated. "That's a good name." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. "I need to go back down to the road," Jacob said. "Check on things. Make sure the car is secure. Can you stay here by the fire while I do that?" Lily nodded. "I'll only be gone an hour, maybe less. There's more soup on the stove if you get hungry. Don't touch the fire, okay?" Another nod. Jacob grabbed his coat and headed back out into the cold. The hike down to the wreckage was harder in daylight. The snow was deeper and the slope was treacherous. When he reached the car, he covered the bodies as best he could with a tarp from his shed. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small gesture of dignity. He found a purse in the front seat and went through it carefully. Driver's license, credit cards, photos. The woman's name was Amanda Morrison. The man, presumably her husband, was Derek Morrison. There was a school picture of Lily, smiling in a blue dress, her hair in pigtails. Jacob pocketed the wallet and the photo. He'd need them when the authorities finally made it up here. By the time he got back to the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. He found Lily exactly where he'd left her, curled up by the fire, the blanket pulled over her head like a cocoon. "I'm back," he said, stamping the snow off his boots. She didn't move. Jacob made dinner, venison stew and cornbread, and set a plate beside her. She picked at it but didn't eat much. He didn't push. He just cleaned up, stoked the fire, and settled into his chair with a book. The first night stretched into the second, then the third. The snow kept falling, and the road stayed buried. Jacob tried the emergency radio every few hours, but all he got was static. The mountain had them cut off completely. He did his best to make Lily comfortable. He gave her his bed and slept on the floor by the fire. He cooked simple meals and left them within reach. He didn't ask her questions, didn't try to force conversation. He just let her exist in the grief, giving her space to process what had happened. On the fourth day, she spoke again. "Why do you live up here?" Jacob looked up from the knife he was sharpening. Lily was sitting cross-legged by the fire, watching him with curious eyes. "It's quiet," he said simply. "Don't you get lonely?" He considered the question. "Sometimes, but lonely is better than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" Jacob smiled faintly. "People." Lily almost smiled at that. Almost. On the fifth day, the emergency radio crackled to life. A voice, distant and distorted, broke through the static. "This is Ridgeline Sheriff's Department. If anyone can hear this, roads are starting to clear. Emergency services are operational. Repeat, emergency services are operational." Jacob grabbed the handset. "This is Jacob Hayes, up on Hayes Ridge. I've got a situation. There was a car accident on the mountain road 5 days ago. 2 fatalities. 1 survivor, a child. Over." There was a long pause, then the voice came back. "Copy that, Hayes. We'll send someone up as soon as we can get through. Sit tight. Over." Jacob hung up the handset and looked at Lily. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "They're coming," he said. She nodded, then looked back at the fire. The sheriff arrived 2 days later, along with a woman from social services. They were kind but efficient, asking questions, taking notes, making calls. They confirmed what Jacob already knew. Amanda and Derek Morrison were dead. Lily was their only child. There was no other family, no grandparents, no siblings, just a distant aunt in Florida who'd already said she couldn't take her. "We'll have to place her in emergency foster care," the social worker said, her voice gentle but firm. "Probably out of county. The system is overwhelmed right now." Jacob looked at Lily, who was sitting on the bed, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. She was staring at the floor, her face blank, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the fabric. "How long before you find her a place?" Jacob asked. "Could be weeks, maybe a month. We're doing our best, but there just aren't enough homes." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She can stay here." Everyone turned to look at him. "What?" the social worker said. "She can stay here," Jacob repeated, "temporarily, until you find her a proper placement. She's been through enough. Moving her around every few days is only going to make it worse." The sheriff frowned. "Hayes, you don't have to do this. We can find somewhere. Where? Jacob asked flatly. You just said the system is overwhelmed. She's comfortable here. She knows me. Let her stay until you find something stable. The social worker exchanged a look with the sheriff, then sighed. We'd have to do a home visit. Background check. The works. Fine. And you'd be responsible for her care, schooling, everything. I understand. The social worker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. We'll make the arrangements. But this is temporary, Mr. Hayes. A few weeks at most. Understood. After they left, the cabin felt quieter than ever. Jacob stood by the window, watching their truck disappear down the road, and wondered what the hell he'd just agreed to. Lily's voice broke the silence. Why did you do that? Jacob turned to find her standing in the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket. Because, he said, you've been through enough. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. Then she nodded and went back to the fire. The weeks that followed developed into a rhythm. Jacob taught Lily the basics of mountain life, not because he had a plan, but because he didn't know what else to do. He showed her how to split kindling, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to tell when the weather was about to turn. She followed him around the cabin and the clearing, quiet but attentive, soaking up everything he said like she was afraid she might forget. She didn't talk much about her parents, and Jacob didn't push. He'd learned that grief had its own timeline, and forcing someone to confront it before they were ready only made it worse. At night, they sat by the fire, and Jacob read to her from the small collection of books he kept on a shelf above his bed. Mostly classics he'd picked up at thrift stores over the years. Jack London, Mark Twain, Laura Ingalls Wilder. Lily listened with her chin on her knees, the firelight dancing across her face, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he saw a flicker of something other than sadness in her eyes. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the accident, Lily wandered over to the stone fireplace while Jacob was outside chopping wood. She ran her small hand along the smooth river stones, tracing the patterns, and then she tapped one of them with her knuckles. It sounded hollow. She frowned and tapped again, harder this time. The sound echoed faintly, like there was space behind it. What are you doing? Lily jumped and spun around. Jacob was standing in the doorway, an armload of firewood in his hands, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Nothing, she said quickly. Just looking. Jacob set the wood down by the hearth and brushed off his hands. You cold? I can build the fire up. No, I'm fine. He nodded, then moved past her to stack the logs. Lily watched him, curious now, but something in his posture told her not to ask. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Jacob stood alone by the fireplace, staring at the stones she'd been touching. His jaw tightened. He pressed his palm flat against the wall, feeling the cold surface beneath his hand, and closed his eyes. 12 years he'd kept that secret. 12 years of silence, isolation, and waiting, and now, for the first time since he'd built this cabin and hidden himself away from the world, someone else was here. Someone who asked questions. Someone who noticed things. Someone who was starting to make him wonder if the life he'd chosen was the life he wanted anymore. He looked over at Lily, curled up under the wool blanket on his bed, her dark hair spilling across the pillow. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she'd survived something that would have broken most adults. Jacob turned back to the fireplace and pressed the stone back into place, making sure the seam was invisible. Not yet, he thought. Not yet. 3 years had passed since that winter storm brought Lily to the mountain, and the cabin that had once been a tomb of silence now rang with something Jacob had forgotten existed. Life. Lily was 10 years old now, though she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone much older. The frightened, traumatized child who'd arrived wrapped in a blanket too big for her body had transformed into something fierce and capable. Her hair was longer now, usually braided to keep it out of her face, and her hands had developed the same calluses Jacob's had. She could split firewood, track a deer through fresh snow, and tell you if rain was coming just by the way the wind shifted through the pines. But more than that, she'd brought warmth back to a place that had been cold for far too long. Jacob stood on the porch in the early morning light, coffee steaming in his hands, watching Lily chase a rabbit through the clearing. She moved like the mountain had taught her, quick and quiet, her boots barely leaving prints in the frost. She wouldn't catch it, she never did, but that wasn't the point. It was the tracking she loved, the puzzle of it, the way you had to think like the animal to understand where it would go next. "You're getting faster," Jacob called out. Lily stopped and turned, grinning. "He's getting slower." Jacob smiled. She'd started calling him Bear about 6 months after she arrived. He'd never asked why, but he suspected it had something to do with his size, his beard, and the way he growled when he first woke up in the morning. The name had stuck, and now he couldn't imagine being called anything else. "Come on," he said. "Breakfast, then lessons." The social worker had checked in exactly 3 times that first year. Each visit, she'd expressed concern about Lily's isolation, her lack of formal schooling, her distance from normal childhood experiences. But each time, she'd also noted that Lily was healthy, well-fed, happy, and learning at a pace that exceeded most kids her age. By the second year, the visits stopped. The paperwork had somehow gotten lost, rerouted, or simply forgotten in a system too overwhelmed to care about one quiet girl living on a mountain with a man who kept to himself. Jacob had never asked questions. He'd just kept doing what he'd been doing, teaching her, protecting her, and slowly, without meaning to, loving her like the daughter he'd never had. Inside, Lily helped him cook breakfast, eggs from the chickens they kept in the small coop behind the cabin, venison sausage he'd made last fall, and thick slices of bread she'd learned to bake in the cast-iron Dutch oven. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from years of living in close quarters with someone who understood when words were necessary and when they weren't. After breakfast, they sat at the rough-hewn table, and Jacob pulled out the books. Math, history, science, literature. He taught her everything he could remember from his own education and everything he could learn from the books he ordered from town. Lily was sharp, almost unnervingly so. She absorbed information like a sponge and asked questions that made him think harder than he had in years. "Why did people think the Earth was flat?" she asked one morning, staring at a diagram in an old astronomy book. "Because they couldn't see the whole thing," Jacob said. "When you're standing on something big enough, it's hard to see its true shape. You have to get some distance first." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you live up here? To get distance?" Jacob paused, his pencil hovering over the page. "Something like that." "Distance from what?" He looked at her, at the curiosity in her dark eyes, and felt the familiar tug of secrets he couldn't share. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "From the noise," he said finally. "The world gets loud sometimes. Up here you can hear yourself think." Lily seemed to accept that, or at least she pretended to. But Jacob caught the way she looked at him sometimes, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The seasons turned, and Lily grew. She learned to fish in the stream that ran through the valley below, to set snares for rabbits, to read the forest for signs of larger predators. Jacob taught her about plants, which ones were edible, which ones could heal, which ones would kill you if you weren't careful. He taught her how to start a fire in the rain, how to find north without a compass, how to move through the woods without leaving a trail. But he also taught her softer things. He read to her at night, not just survival guides and field manuals, but stories that made her laugh or gasp or sit up straighter with excitement. He taught her to play chess on a hand-carved board he'd made years ago, and she beat him for the first time when she was 11. He showed her how to whittle, how to mend clothes, how to make soap from ash and fat. The cabin filled with her presence. Her drawings hung on the walls, charcoal sketches of trees, animals, the view from the ridge at sunset. Her books lined the shelves. Her laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for over a decade. And Jacob, who had spent 12 years convinced he was better off alone, found himself wondering how he'd ever lived without her. They went to town together once a month, and each trip was an event. Lily would dress in her cleanest clothes, braid her hair carefully, and chatter the whole way down the mountain about what supplies they needed, what she wanted to see, whether they might stop at the diner for pie. The locals had gotten used to them over the years, the gruff mountain man and the bright-eyed girl who always walked a half-step behind him, watching everything with quiet intensity. "That your daughter, Jacob?" the woman at the general store asked once. Jacob didn't correct her. "Yeah, that's Lily. She's growing up fast. Too fast." The woman smiled knowingly. They always do. But not everyone in town looked at them with warmth. There were whispers, speculation about who Jacob really was and where the girl had come from. Some folks remembered the accident, remembered the bodies they'd pulled from the wreckage, and wondered if it was right for a man like Jacob, a loner, a hermit, someone with no history anyone could trace, to be raising a child. Jacob felt their eyes on him every time he walked down Main Street. He heard the conversations that stopped when he got too close, but he ignored them. He'd spent too many years caring what people thought, and it had nearly gotten him killed. One afternoon in early fall, when Lily was 12, they were splitting wood behind the cabin when she brought up the wall again. "Bear," she said, setting down her axe. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "That wall, the one by the fireplace, why does it sound hollow?" Jacob's hands stilled on the log he was holding. He'd known this was coming, had been expecting it for years, but that didn't make it easier. "It's just the way it's built," he said, not looking at her. "Stone walls do that sometimes." "But it doesn't sound like the other walls." "Lily." "I'm not stupid, Bear. I know there's something back there. I've known for years." Jacob set down his axe and turned to face her. She was standing with her arms crossed, chin lifted, eyes sharp. She looked so much older than 12 in that moment, old enough to demand the truth, even if he wasn't ready to give it. "There are things about my life before this cabin that I can't talk about," Jacob said carefully. "Not because I don't trust you, but because they're dangerous. The less you know, the safer you are." "Safer from what?" "From people who might come looking." Lily's expression shifted, something between fear and fascination. "Are you a criminal?" "No." "Then what?" Jacob sighed and rubbed his hand over his face. "I'm someone who saw something he shouldn't have, and the people who didn't want him to see it made sure he disappeared." "But you didn't disappear. You came here." "Same thing." Lily was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said, "If someone comes looking, will they hurt us?" "I won't let that happen." "Promise?" Jacob looked at her, at the girl who'd become his entire world, and nodded. "Promise." She seemed satisfied with that, or at least willing to let it go. But Jacob knew it wouldn't be the last time she asked. Lily was too smart, too curious, too aware of the inconsistencies in the life he'd built. One day he'd have to tell her everything. He just hoped that day was still a long way off. But the mountain had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday in late spring when Lily was 13. Jacob was fixing a section of fence near the tree line when he saw movement on the trail that led up from the road. His hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt, and he squinted against the sun. A man was hiking up the path, alone, dressed in gear that was too new, too clean. He moved like someone who wasn't used to altitude, stopping every few yards to catch his breath. When he spotted Jacob, he raised a hand in greeting and called out, "Hello there, beautiful property you've got." Jacob didn't move. "Can I help you?" The man reached the fence and leaned against it, breathing hard. He was in his 30s, fit despite the altitude, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just passing through, doing some hiking in the area, saw your cabin from the ridge and thought I'd say hello. Not many folks live up this high." "There's a reason for that." The man chuckled. "I bet. Must be tough in winter." "We manage." "We?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Me and my daughter." The man's eyes flicked past Jacob toward the cabin, where Lily was visible through the window, reading at the table. "She's a lucky kid, growing up out here, learning to be self-sufficient. That's rare these days." Something about the way he said it made Jacob's instincts flare. "You should keep moving. Storm's coming in tonight. You don't want to get caught on the trail." The man glanced at the clear blue sky. "Looks pretty calm to me." It won't be. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Jacob saw something shift in the man's expression. A calculation, a decision being made. Then the man smiled again and pushed off from the fence. Well, thanks for the warning. I'll be on my way. You take care now. Jacob watched him disappear back down the trail, every nerve in his body screaming that something was wrong. The man hadn't been lost. He hadn't been a casual hiker. He'd been looking for something, or someone. That night, Jacob secured the cabin differently. He checked the locks twice, loaded his rifle and set it by the door, and closed all the shutters, even though it made the interior dark and claustrophobic. Lily noticed immediately. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, just being cautious. Because of that man? You saw him? I see everything, Bear. Jacob looked at her, and for the first time, he realized she wasn't a child anymore. She was a teenager, sharp and observant, and she knew when he was lying. I don't trust him, Jacob admitted. He asked too many questions, looked at things too carefully. Do you think he's one of them, the people you're hiding from? I don't know, maybe. Lily nodded slowly. What do we do? We stay alert, and if anyone comes back, you do exactly what I tell you. Understand? Understand. But no one came. Not that night. Not the next day. Not the next week. Jacob started to relax, started to believe maybe he'd been paranoid, maybe the man had just been what he claimed, a hiker who'd wandered too close. Then, 2 months later, 2 more men arrived. They drove up in a black SUV, navigating the rough mountain road with the kind of confidence that came from experience. Jacob saw them coming from half a mile away and sent Lily into the woods with a whistle command they'd practiced 100 times. She disappeared into the trees without a word, and Jacob stood on the porch, arms crossed, waiting. The men who stepped out of the vehicle wore suits that were somehow still crisp despite the dust and heat. They had the look of federal agents, clean-cut, professional, armed. One was older, maybe 50, with grey at his temples. The other was younger, harder, with the kind of eyes that had seen things they couldn't forget. Jacob Hayes, the older one asked. Depends on who's asking. The man pulled out a badge. Special Agent Dennis Cole, FBI. This is Agent Martinez. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Jacob's blood ran cold, but his expression didn't change. About what? About your past. About why a federal investigator who was declared dead 15 years ago is living alone on a mountain under his real name. What happens next will turn this quiet mountain sanctuary into a battlefield of secrets, force Jacob to confront the life he left behind, and make a choice between the truth that could save millions and the daughter who's become his entire world. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Jacob's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. I think you've got the wrong person. Agent Cole smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We both know that's not true. You were one of the best investigators the Treasury Department ever had. You uncovered the largest disaster relief fraud in U.S. history, and then you disappeared along with evidence worth $280 million. Like I said, wrong person. Agent Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice flat and hard. We've been looking for you for a long time, Hayes. Thought you were dead. Most people did. But then a hiker reported seeing a man matching your description living up here with a kid. That got us curious. Jacob's jaw tightened. The hiker. He'd been right not to trust him. What do you want? Jacob asked. The evidence, Cole said simply. The documents, the money, all of it. There are people who should be in prison, Hayes. People who stole from disaster victims, from families who lost everything. You were supposed to bring them to justice, but instead, you vanished. I had my reasons. I'm sure you did, but that doesn't change the fact that you're sitting on evidence of federal crimes. We need it. And if I don't have it, Martinez stepped forward, then we'll tear this cabin apart until we find it. And we'll arrest you for obstruction, theft of federal property, and about a dozen other charges I can think of. Jacob stared at them, his mind racing. He'd known this day might come, had prepared for it in 100 different ways. But none of those plans had included Lily. None of them had included having someone he loved caught in the crossfire. "I need time," Jacob said. "Time for what?" "To think. To figure out what I'm willing to give you." Cole studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got 72 hours. After that, we come back with a warrant and a team. And Hayes?" He paused at the door of the SUV. "The past always catches up. You should know that better than anyone." They drove away, leaving Jacob standing alone on the porch, the weight of 15 years of secrets pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Lily emerged from the woods an hour later, moving silently through the trees until she was standing beside him. She didn't ask if they were gone. She already knew. "Who were they?" she asked. "Federal agents? Looking for you?" "Yes." "Because of what's behind the wall?" Jacob looked at her, and he saw no fear in her eyes. Just determination, just trust. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to tell me the truth now?" Jacob took a deep breath and nodded. "Soon, I promise. But first, I need to figure out what the truth is worth." They went inside, and Jacob spent the rest of the day pacing, thinking, weighing options that all felt impossible. He could run, take Lily and disappear again. But where would they go? He wasn't young anymore, wasn't as sharp as he'd once been. And Lily deserved better than a life on the run. He could turn over the evidence, let the agents have what they wanted. But that would mean trusting a system that had betrayed him once before, trusting that this time would be different. Or he could do nothing, wait for them to come back and fight. But that would put Lily in danger, and that was something he couldn't accept. The days passed, and Jacob felt the clock ticking down. He taught Lily her lessons, chopped wood, made repairs to the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities, searching for a solution that didn't exist. On the third night, during a storm that shook the cabin and sent rain hammering against the roof, Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a tightness, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. He tried to stand from his chair by the fire, but his legs wouldn't hold him. The room tilted, and he collapsed. Lily was at his side in an instant, her hands on his face, her voice cutting through the fog in his head. "Bear! Bear, stay with me!" Jacob tried to speak, but his words came out slurred and wrong. His left arm had gone numb, and there was a crushing weight in his chest that felt like the mountain itself was pressing down on him. Lily didn't panic. She did exactly what he'd taught her. She checked his pulse, loosened his collar, propped his head up on a pillow. She ran to the cabinet where he kept the emergency medical supplies and found the aspirin, crushing it and putting it under his tongue. Then she grabbed the emergency radio and started calling for help. "This is Lily Hayes up on Hayes Ridge, medical emergency. I need an airlift now." The response was crackling and distant, but it came. "Copy that. Weather's too rough for a helicopter. Sending an ambulance to the base of the mountain. Can you get him down?" Lily looked at Jacob, at the man who'd saved her life and taught her how to survive, and made a decision. "I'll get him down." She fashioned a sled from the tarp and rope Jacob kept in the shed, wrapped him in blankets, and dragged him out into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the trail was a river of mud, but she didn't stop. She pulled him for 3 hours, her muscles screaming, her hands bleeding, until she saw the lights of the ambulance waiting at the base of the mountain. The paramedics took over, loading Jacob into the back and racing toward the hospital in Ridgeline. Lily climbed in beside him, holding his hand, refusing to let go. "You're not leaving me," she whispered. "You promised." Jacob squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes flickering open just enough to see her face. In the hospital, the doctors stabilized him. It was a heart attack, they said. Not severe, but serious. He'd need rest, medication, lifestyle changes. He was lucky to be alive. Lily sat beside his bed for 3 days, refusing to leave, refusing to eat until he ate first. On the 4th day, Jacob finally spoke. "You saved my life. You saved mine first. That's different." "No," Lily said firmly. "It's not." Jacob looked at her, at the girl who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered, and felt something break open in his chest. Not his heart this time, but something deeper. The walls he'd built around himself, the secrets he'd carried, the fear that had kept him isolated for so long. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, "about everything." "Okay. It's going to change how you see me." "I don't think it will." Jacob smiled faintly. "You're probably right." He told her to wait until they got home, until he was strong enough to show her. And when they finally returned to the cabin a week later, Jacob, stronger but still weak, he led her to the fireplace. "I need to show you what's behind that wall," he said. Lily nodded, her heart pounding, and watched as Jacob reached up and pressed 3 specific stones in a sequence only he knew. The wall clicked, then slowly swung inward, revealing the darkness beyond. The stone wall swung inward with a sound like a whisper, revealing a narrow opening that exhaled cool, stale air into the warmth of the cabin. Jacob stood beside it, one hand still pressed against the stones, breathing slowly through the lingering pain in his chest. Lily stared at the darkness beyond, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Come on," Jacob said quietly, reaching for the flashlight he kept on the mantel. "It's time you saw what I've been protecting." He stepped through the opening, and after a moment's hesitation, Lily followed. The hidden room was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, carved directly into the mountain rock behind the cabin. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, the kind you'd see in an old government office, and in the center of the room sat a large wooden trunk with heavy brass corners. The air smelled like old paper, metal, and secrets that had been locked away for too long. Jacob moved to the trunk first, his movements careful and deliberate. He knelt beside it, wincing slightly at the pull in his chest, and worked the combination lock with practiced fingers. The lock clicked open, and he lifted the lid. Lily's breath caught. Inside were stacks of cash, bundled and wrapped in plastic, more money than she'd ever seen in her life. But that wasn't all. Beneath the cash were bearer bonds in denominations that made no sense to her, gold coins sealed in protective cases, and folders stuffed with documents that looked official and dangerous. "Is that real?" Lily whispered. "Every dollar," Jacob said. "Every bond, every coin." "How much?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, then said, "In the trunk, about $47 million. In the filing cabinets, evidence that leads to another $233 million that was stolen and hidden in offshore accounts, real estate, shell companies." Lily felt dizzy. She reached out to steady herself against the wall, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, what she was hearing. "Did you steal it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No." Jacob looked up at her, his eyes dark and serious in the beam of the flashlight. "But I took it from people who did, and they've been looking for it, and for me, ever since." He stood slowly, his hand going to his chest again, and gestured to the filing cabinets. "That's where the real story is. The proof, the evidence. Everything I spent 3 years of my life collecting before it all fell apart." Lily moved to the nearest cabinet and pulled open a drawer. Inside were files, meticulously organized, each one labeled with names she didn't recognize and dates going back decades. She pulled one out at random and opened it. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer records, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands, and handwritten notes in Jacob's precise script connecting dots, building cases, documenting crimes. "What is all this?" she asked. Jacob leaned against the trunk, his face pale but his voice steady. "It's the biggest disaster relief fraud in American history, and I'm the only person who knows the full scope of it." He took a breath, gathering his strength, and began to tell her the story he'd kept buried for 15 years. "My name is Jacob Thomas Hayes. I was a federal investigator for the Treasury Department, specifically the Financial Crimes Division. I started there when I was 26, right out of the army, and I was good at it. Really good. I had a knack for seeing patterns other people missed, for following money trails that seemed to disappear into nothing." Jacob moved to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a folder marked Project Clearwater, 1998 to 2003. In 1998, he continued, Hurricane Clearwater hit the Gulf Coast, Category 5, wiped out entire towns, killed over 3,000 people, left 100,000 more homeless. The federal government approved $16 billion in disaster relief. Money for rebuilding homes, infrastructure, hospitals, schools. Money that was supposed to help people put their lives back together. He opened the folder and spread documents across the top of the trunk. But only about half of it actually made it to the victims. The rest disappeared into a network of shell companies, fake construction firms, and fraudulent contracts. And nobody noticed because the system was overwhelmed, the paperwork was a mess, and everyone was too busy dealing with the crisis to audit the spending. Lily stared at the documents, at the numbers that seemed impossible, at the names written in the margins. How did you find it? By accident, Jacob said. I was investigating a low-level money laundering case in 2001, following a trail from a drug cartel to a businessman in Miami. But when I started pulling at that thread, I found something else. Wire transfers that didn't make sense, payments to construction companies that didn't exist, contracts signed by people who'd been dead for years. He pulled out another folder, then another. The more I dug, the bigger it got. It wasn't just one hurricane. It was dozens. Clearwater in 98, the California wildfires in 99, the tornado outbreaks in 2000. Every major disaster over a 5-year period had been used as cover for the largest theft of federal funds anyone had ever attempted. Jacob's voice was getting rougher now, his emotion breaking through. And the people behind it? They weren't street criminals. They were senators, federal judges, state governors, FEMA administrators, treasury officials, people at the highest levels of government, people who were supposed to protect citizens, not rob them. Lily felt sick. How many people were involved? At least 50 that I could prove, probably twice that many I couldn't. The network stretched from Washington to state capitals to local governments. Everyone had their hand in the pot, and everyone had a reason to keep quiet. But you didn't keep quiet, Lily said. Jacob shook his head. I couldn't. I'd seen too much. I knew what that money was supposed to do, who it was supposed to help. Families who'd lost everything, kids who didn't have homes, towns that couldn't rebuild their schools or hospitals. That money was stolen from people who had nothing left to steal. He sat down on the trunk, exhausted now, but committed to finishing the story. I spent 3 years building the case. I worked in secret, told only my direct supervisor, followed every lead, documented every transaction. By 2003, I had everything. Names, dates, account numbers, wire transfers, recorded conversations. I had enough to take down the entire network. So what happened? Lily asked, though part of her already knew. Jacob's expression darkened. I took it to my supervisor, told him I was ready to present the evidence to the Attorney General to start making arrests. He congratulated me, told me I'd done brilliant work, said he'd set up a meeting with the AG's office for the following week. He paused, and Lily saw his hands shake slightly. 3 days later, someone tried to kill me. The room seemed to get colder. I was working late at the office, Jacob continued, his voice hollow with the memory. Going through files one more time, making sure everything was perfect. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple people moving fast. I looked up and saw 4 men in tactical gear coming through the door with guns drawn. Lily's hand went to her mouth. I ran, Jacob said simply. Went through the back exit, down 6 flights of stairs, out into the street. They chased me for 8 blocks before I lost them in a subway station. I didn't go home, didn't call anyone. I went to a hotel under a fake name and tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. He pulled out another document, this one a news article from 2003. The headline read, Treasury investigator dies in explosion, gas leak suspected. They bombed my apartment that night, Jacob said. Made it look like an accident. My supervisor gave a statement saying I'd been under a lot of stress lately, that I'd been working too hard. The investigation was closed within 48 hours. Lily's eyes were burning. But you weren't dead. No, but Jacob Hayes was. The man who'd built that case, who'd trusted the system, who'd believed that justice would win if you just followed the rules. That man died in the explosion. Jacob stood and walked to the filing cabinets, running his hand along the metal surfaces. I realized what had happened. My supervisor was part of it. Maybe he'd been from the beginning, or maybe they'd gotten to him after I showed him the evidence. Either way, the people I was trying to expose knew everything. They knew what I had, they knew where it was, and they knew I had to die. "But you got the evidence out," Lily said, looking at the cabinets. "Barely. I had copies stored in 3 different locations because I'm paranoid. I went to all 3 in one night, destroyed 2 sets completely, and took the 3rd. Then I went to the one place I knew the money was being stored before it got laundered and redistributed. A private warehouse in Virginia that was supposed to be holding disaster relief supplies." Jacob's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I broke in, found the cash, the bonds, the gold. All of it just sitting there in crates marked medical supplies and building materials. I took what I could carry and burned the rest. If I couldn't expose them, I could at least make sure they didn't profit." "How much did you take?" $47 million in physical assets. But I also had the account numbers, the passwords, the routing information for the rest. I moved it all into offshore accounts they couldn't trace, locked it down, and made sure nobody could access it without codes that only I had. Lily was shaking now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was telling her. Then what? Then I ran. I had fake IDs prepared, emergency funds stashed, and a plan I'd been working on since I first realized how deep the corruption went. I disappeared. Changed my name, changed my appearance, moved around for a year making sure nobody was following me. Eventually, I ended up here. He gestured to the cabin around them. I built this place with my own hands, paid cash for the land under a name that didn't exist, made sure I was far enough from civilization that nobody would stumble across me, but close enough that I could get supplies when I needed them. And I waited. For what? For the right time, the right person, the right way to expose everything without getting killed in the process. Jacob looked at her with an expression that broke her heart. But years passed, and I could never figure out how. The people I was fighting, they were too powerful, too connected. Every contact I'd had, every ally I'd trusted, I couldn't be sure they weren't compromised. So I just stayed here, kept the evidence safe, kept the money locked away, and tried to convince myself that I'd done the right thing. "You did," Lily said fiercely. Jacob smiled sadly. "Did I? I have $280 million and evidence of the biggest fraud in federal history, and it's been sitting in a hole in the ground for 15 years while the people who stole it walked free. The victims I wanted to help, they never got their money back. They rebuilt their lives without it, or they didn't rebuild at all. And the criminals? They're probably senators and governors now, living in mansions, sleeping soundly at night." His voice cracked. "I saved the evidence, but I didn't save anyone." Lily crossed the small room and took his hands in hers. "You saved me." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. "That was different." "No," Lily said, her voice strong and clear. "It wasn't. You found me in a wrecked car in the middle of a blizzard when I had nothing and no one. You took me in. You kept me safe. You taught me how to survive, how to think, how to be strong. You gave up your mission to protect me, Bear. That's not failure. That's love." Jacob pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his shoulders shaking. They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by the physical evidence of everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd lost, everything he'd chosen to let go of when a 7-year-old girl had needed him more than justice did. Finally, Jacob pulled back and wiped his eyes. "There's something else you need to know." Lily waited. "The heart attack," he said. "It wasn't just bad luck. I've had heart problems for years. The stress, the isolation, the constant fear. It takes a toll. The doctors at the hospital ran tests. They said my heart is badly damaged. Scarring from the attack, weakened muscle tissue, irregular rhythms they can't fully control with medication." "So we'll manage it," Lily said quickly. "You'll take your pills, we'll watch your diet, you'll rest more." "Lily," Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "They gave me 2 years, maybe 3 if I'm lucky, but probably not." The room seemed to tilt. "No," Lily said, shaking her head. No, that's not. We'll get a second opinion. We'll find a specialist. There has to be something. I've already accepted it, Jacob said. I'm not afraid of dying, Lily. I made peace with that possibility 15 years ago. What I'm afraid of is leaving you alone with this. He gestured to the room around them. This burden, this choice. Lily felt tears streaming down her face. I don't want the money. I don't want any of it. I just want you to stay. I know, but we don't always get what we want. Jacob guided her to sit beside him on the trunk. I need you to listen now. Really listen. Because this is important. Lily nodded, trying to control her breathing. That money doesn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to you, Jacob said. It belongs to the people it was stolen from. Disaster victims who never got the help they were promised. And the evidence in those cabinets? It can still bring down the people who stole it. Maybe not all of them. Some are probably dead by now. But enough. Enough to matter. So what are you saying? I'm saying the choice is yours. You can walk away from all of this, seal up this room, leave the cabin, and live your life. Nobody knows you're connected to me, not really. You could disappear, start fresh, be whoever you want to be. Or... Jacob pulled out a small metal box from inside the trunk. He opened it to reveal a USB drive, a notebook filled with codes and passwords, and a list of names with phone numbers beside them. Or you finish what I started. You take this evidence and find someone who can use it. Someone clean, someone outside the system, someone who'll make sure the truth gets out. The money gets returned to victims or their families, the criminals face justice. The story I couldn't tell gets told. Lily stared at the box, at the weight of responsibility it represented. How would I even do that? There's a journalist, Jacob said, flipping open the notebook. Her name is Sarah Chen. I've been following her work for years. She's taken down corrupt politicians, exposed corporate fraud, and she's never once backed down from a fight. She's one of the few people in this country I'd trust with something this big. He pointed to a number written in the margin. You contact her. You tell her who you are and what you have. You let her guide you through the process of going public safely. And what if they come after me like they came after you? They might. That's why you have to be smart about it. You don't go to them. You don't meet in person until you're sure it's safe. You send the evidence digitally first, encrypted, through channels they can't trace. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's already out there, already public. They can't put the genie back in the bottle. Lily's hands were shaking. Bear, I'm 16 years old. I don't know anything about encryption or digital security or fighting government corruption. I can barely navigate a computer. You taught me how to survive in the woods, not how to take down a criminal conspiracy. I know, Jacob said softly. And I'm sorry. I never wanted this to be your problem. But life doesn't always give us the choices we want. He took her face in his hands. You're the strongest person I know, Lily. You survived losing your parents. You survived growing up on this mountain with a paranoid old man who didn't know the first thing about raising kids. You saved my life when I had a heart attack in the middle of a storm. If anyone can do this, it's you. What if I don't want to? Then you don't. I won't force this on you. I won't make you promise something you're not ready to commit to. This is your life and you get to choose how you live it. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of 15 years pressing down on both of them. Finally, Lily spoke. Tell me about them, the victims. Jacob looked surprised. What? The people who were robbed. Tell me about them. I need to know who we'd be doing this for. Jacob nodded slowly and pulled out another folder. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, personal stories he'd collected during his investigation. This is Maria Rodriguez, he said, holding up a photo of a woman in her 50s standing in front of a destroyed house. Her home was destroyed by Hurricane Clearwater. She was promised $73,000 to rebuild. She got $9,000, had to live in a FEMA trailer for 4 years before she could afford to fix her foundation. He pulled out another photo. This is James and Patricia Westerfield, lost their farm in the California wildfires. They were supposed to get $200,000 in disaster relief, got $52,000. They're still paying off the loans they had to take out just to survive. Another photo. This is Daniel Kim, lost his parents and his younger sister in the tornado outbreak of 2000. He was 18. The government was supposed to provide death benefits and housing assistance. He got $6,000 total and ended up homeless for 2 years. Jacob spread the photos across the trunk, dozens of them, faces of people who'd lost everything and then been robbed again by the very system that was supposed to protect them. "These are the people I wanted to save," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "These are the families who should have gotten that $280 million. Kids who should have gone to college, parents who should have retired with dignity, communities that should have been rebuilt." Lily picked up one of the photos, a young girl maybe 8 years old, standing in the rubble of what used to be her school. She looked lost, devastated, scared. "She looks like me," Lily whispered. "After the accident. That same look." "Yes," Jacob said, "she does." Lily set the photo down carefully and looked at the money in the trunk, at the files in the cabinets, at the USB drive that held the power to change everything. "If I do this," she said slowly, "and something happens to me, if they come after me the way they came after you, will it have been worth it?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He thought about it, really thought about it, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I think the question isn't whether it's worth dying for. The question is whether it's worth living for. Whether it's worth standing up and saying, this was wrong and someone needs to make it right, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when it would be easier to walk away." He looked at her with an expression full of love and pride and sadness. "I couldn't save those people, Lily, but maybe you can. Not by bringing them back, not by erasing what happened to them, but by making sure the truth comes out, by making sure the people who robbed them face consequences, by making sure that stolen money goes where it was always supposed to go." Lily felt something shift inside her, something she'd been carrying since she was 7 years old and watched her parents die. A sense of purpose, a reason to take all the pain and grief and fear she'd lived with and turn it into something that mattered. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me everything I need to know. Show me how to encrypt files, how to contact Sarah Chen safely, how to protect myself. Teach me how to finish this." Jacob pulled her into his arms again, and this time when he held her, it felt less like comfort and more like preparation, like a soldier passing his weapon to the next generation, trusting them to finish the fight. "We'll start tomorrow," he said. "I'll teach you everything. But tonight, let's just be father and daughter. Let's sit by the fire and read a book and pretend that the world outside this cabin doesn't exist." "Okay," Lily whispered. "Okay, Bear." They sealed the hidden room and went back into the main cabin. Jacob built up the fire while Lily made tea, and they settled into their familiar positions, him in his chair, her curled up on the rug with a blanket. He read to her from an old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, his voice steady and warm, and for a few hours they were just what they'd always been. A man and a girl, a father and a daughter. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and decided to hold on tight. But in the morning, everything would change. In the morning, Lily's education would begin. Not in tracking deer or reading weather patterns, but in digital security, encryption protocols, investigative journalism contacts, and the kind of courage it took to stand up to power, even when power wanted to crush you. In the morning, Jacob would start teaching her how to finish what he'd started 15 years ago. And somewhere deep in her heart, Lily knew that this was what she'd been preparing for all along. Every lesson he'd taught her about survival, about thinking strategically, about staying calm under pressure, it had all been leading here, to this choice, to this mission, to the moment when she would have to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. As she fell asleep that night, her head resting against Jacob's leg while the fire crackled in the hearth, Lily made herself a promise. She would finish this. Not because Jacob asked her to, but because it was right. Because those faces in the photographs deserved justice. Because the truth mattered more than fear. And because the mountain man who'd taken in an orphaned girl and taught her how to be strong had shown her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, even when it costs you everything. The winter that followed was unlike any other Lily had experienced on the mountain. The days were short and cold, but inside the cabin, a different kind of work was happening. Jacob set up a laptop, one he'd kept hidden and unused for years, and began teaching Lily everything she needed to know. He showed her how to use encryption software, how to route communications through virtual private networks, how to create email addresses that couldn't be traced back to her. He taught her about digital footprints and how to minimize them, about secure messaging apps and dead drops and all the tools of modern information warfare. But more than that, he taught her about the case itself. They spent hours going through the files, with Jacob explaining the connections between names, the flow of money, the structure of the conspiracy. Lily took notes in a journal she kept hidden under her mattress, committing details to memory in case she ever lost access to the digital files. The key to exposing corruption, Jacob told her one night, is creating a narrative people can follow. It's not enough to have evidence. You have to make people care. You have to show them the human cost, make them understand what was lost and who lost it. Lily listened, absorbed, transformed. She was 17 now, and the weight of what she was preparing to do had changed her. She moved with more purpose, spoke with more confidence, and carried herself like someone who knew that the world was bigger than the mountain and that she had a role to play in it. Jacob watched her grow with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. His health was declining faster than the doctors had predicted. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed. Other days he'd have to stop mid-sentence, clutching his chest, waiting for the pain to pass. But he kept teaching, kept preparing her, knowing that his time was running out. On a clear day in late March, when the snow was finally starting to melt and the first signs of spring were appearing on the mountain, Jacob sat Lily down at the table and handed her a sealed envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Instructions," Jacob said, "for after, contacts you can trust, lawyers who specialize in whistleblower protections, even a place you can go if you need to disappear for a while. Everything's in there." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Bear, don't—" "We both know it's time," Jacob said gently. "I can feel it. A few more weeks, maybe. A month if I'm lucky, but not much longer. I'm not ready. You're more ready than you think." He took her hands in his, which were thinner now, weaker. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll finish this. Not for me, but for them. For Maria Rodriguez and James Westerfield and Daniel Kim and all the others. Promise me you'll make sure the truth comes out." Lily's tears spilled over, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I promise, Bear. I'll finish it. I'll make sure they can't hide anymore." Jacob smiled, and for a moment he looked like the man she'd first met 10 years ago. Strong, certain, unafraid. "That's my girl," he whispered. They spent the next few weeks together, making the most of the time they had left. They took walks when Jacob had the strength, cooked meals together, played chess, and talked about everything and nothing. Jacob told her stories from his childhood, from his time in the army, from the years before he became an investigator. He wanted her to remember him as more than just the mission, more than just the secrets. He wanted her to remember him as her father. One warm afternoon in April, Jacob was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun set over the mountains when Lily came out and sat beside him. "It's beautiful up here," she said. "It is. Thank you for bringing me here, for keeping me safe, for teaching me everything." Jacob reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you for saving me, Lily, for reminding me that there's more to life than running and hiding. You gave me purpose again. You gave me a reason to hope." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. When it was fully dark and the first stars were beginning to appear, Jacob spoke one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the money isn't the mission. Justice is the mission. Truth is the mission. Making sure those people's stories are heard, that's what matters." "I'll remember," Lily promised. That night, Jacob Hayes died peacefully in his sleep. Lily found him in the morning, still and quiet, a slight smile on his face like he'd finally found the rest he'd been searching for. She didn't cry right away. She sat beside the bed and held his hand and told him about her plans, about how she'd contact Sarah Chen, about how she'd make sure everything he'd worked for finally saw the light of day. Then she stood, walked outside into the crisp mountain air, and let herself break. The funeral was small, just Lily and the sheriff and a handful of people from town who'd known Jacob well enough to respect him. They buried him on the ridge overlooking the cabin, where he could watch over the place he'd built and the girl he'd saved. Lily stood at the grave long after everyone else had left, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw set with determination. "I'll finish it," she said to the freshly turned earth. "I promise, Bear. I'll finish it." And as the wind whispered through the pines and the sun climbed higher in the spring sky, Lily turned away from the grave and walked back to the cabin. She had work to do. 6 months after Jacob's death, Lily sat alone in the cabin as winter settled back over the mountain. She was 18 now, legally an adult, though she felt decades older. The cabin was exactly as Jacob had left it. His chair by the fire, his tools hung on their hooks, his books lined up on the shelves. But his presence was gone, and the silence that had once been comfortable now pressed against her like a weight she couldn't shake. She'd spent these months doing what Jacob had taught her, thinking, planning, researching every option. The hidden room behind the stone wall remained sealed. She'd gone in only once since his death, just to make sure everything was secure, and the sight of all that money, all that evidence, had made her physically ill. $280 million. The number haunted her dreams. It represented so much pain, so much loss, so many lives destroyed by greed. And now the responsibility for making it right belonged to her. But every path forward seemed impossible. She couldn't just turn the evidence over to the authorities. Jacob had taught her that the corruption went too deep, that the same system that had tried to kill him might still be compromised. The people he'd been investigating had had 15 years to consolidate power, to cover their tracks, to position themselves where they could squash any investigation before it gained momentum. But she also couldn't keep the money. Every dollar in that trunk was stolen from someone who'd already lost everything. Keeping it felt like being complicit in the theft, like allowing the criminals to win simply because exposing them was too dangerous or too hard. And she couldn't run. She'd thought about it during the dark nights when the wind howled and the cabin felt too empty. She could seal the room, walk away, disappear into a normal life somewhere far from this mountain. But every time she considered it, she saw the faces from those photographs. Maria Rodriguez, James Westerfield, Daniel Kim, the little girl standing in the rubble of her school. They deserved better than her cowardice. So Lily did what Jacob had done all those years ago. She prepared. She studied everything in the hidden room until she knew the case as well as he had. She practiced encryption protocols until they were second nature. She researched Sarah Chen, the journalist Jacob had trusted, reading every article she'd ever written, every investigation she'd ever conducted. Chen was fearless. She'd exposed corruption in pharmaceutical companies, police departments, political campaigns. She'd been sued, threatened, even physically assaulted, but she never backed down. If anyone could handle a story this big, it was her. But reaching out to her felt like stepping off a cliff. Once Lily made that call, once she sent that first encrypted message, there would be no going back. The wheels would be in motion, and she'd have to see it through to the end, no matter what that end looked like. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when Lily was checking the post office box she maintained in Ridgeline. Among the bills and junk mail was a newsletter from a disaster relief non-profit. On the front page was a story about Hurricane Clearwater survivors, marking the 25th anniversary of the storm. 25 years, and they were still struggling, still rebuilding, still waiting for help that should have come decades ago. Lily sat in her truck in the post office parking lot and read the entire newsletter. Stories of families who'd never fully recovered, of communities still fighting to restore what had been lost, of children who'd grown up in poverty because the support they'd been promised never materialized. and she thought about the $47 million sitting in a trunk in her cabin. Money that could change every single one of those lives. That night, Lily opened her encrypted laptop, took a deep breath, and began typing. Dear Miss Chen, my name is Lily Hayes. You don't know me, but I have information about a story that I believe you'll want to investigate. It involves the largest disaster relief fraud in American history, $280 million in stolen federal funds, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. I have evidence, documents, financial records, witness statements, everything you'd need to prove it. But I need your help to make sure this story is told safely and correctly. If you're interested, please respond to this email with the word Clearwater, and I'll know it's really you. If I don't hear back within 1 week, I'll assume you're not interested and I'll look for someone else. Time is critical. People have been waiting 25 years for justice. They shouldn't have to wait any longer. Sincerely, LH. She read the message 15 times, checking for anything that might identify her or compromise her security. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. 3 days later, a response arrived. One word: Clearwater. Lily's hands shook as she typed her reply, following the security protocols Jacob had taught her. She explained who Jacob had been, what he'd discovered, how he'd died protecting the evidence. She didn't reveal where she was or who she was, only that she was his daughter and that she wanted to finish what he'd started. Sarah Chen's response was cautious but intrigued. She asked for proof, something that would verify the story was real and not an elaborate hoax. Lily sent encrypted copies of 3 documents. A wire transfer record showing $2 million moving from a FEMA account to a shell company. A photograph of a politician who was now a senator shaking hands with a contractor who'd been indicted for fraud, and a page from Jacob's original investigation notes that included details never made public. Chen's next message came within an hour. We need to talk, in person. Name the place. They met in a diner in a town 3 hours from Ridgeline, a place neither of them had ever been before. Lily arrived first, choosing a booth in the back corner where she could watch the door. She was 19 now. This meeting had taken months to arrange safely, and she'd learned to trust her instincts about danger. When Sarah Chen walked in, Lily recognized her immediately from the photos online. She was in her early 40s, Chinese American, with sharp eyes and an intensity that radiated from her like heat. She ordered coffee, slid into the booth across from Lily, and got straight to the point. Show me what you have. Lily pulled out a tablet loaded with encrypted files and slid it across the table. Everything's on here. Financial records, witness statements, photographs, audio recordings, Jacob's investigation notes. 25 years of fraud documented in excruciating detail. Sarah spent the next 2 hours scrolling through files, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to barely contained fury. She made notes in a leather journal, asked questions that Lily answered as thoroughly as she could, and twice excused herself to make phone calls outside. When she came back from the second call, she sat down heavily and stared at Lily like she was seeing her for the first time. Do you understand what you're sitting on? Sarah asked quietly. Yes. This isn't just a story. This is going to bring down governors, senators, maybe even a Supreme Court justice if these connections hold. People will go to prison, careers will be destroyed, and the moment this goes public, everyone involved will be looking for the source. I know. They might come after you. They might try to discredit you, intimidate you, or worse. They killed Jacob, Lily said flatly. They've already done worse. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We build the story carefully, methodically. We verify every single piece of evidence, cross-reference every claim, interview as many victims as we can find. We make this story bulletproof so that when it goes public they can't attack the facts, only the messenger. How long will that take? 6 months, maybe 8. That's too long. The statute of limitations is already passed for some of the crimes, Sarah interrupted, but not all. And more importantly, public pressure can reopen investigations, trigger audits, force reckonings, even when the legal window has closed. Trust me on this. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Lily wanted to argue, wanted to push for immediate action, but she thought about what Jacob had taught her. Patience was a weapon. Preparation was armor. If they rushed this and failed, the story would be buried forever. "Okay," she said, "6 months, but I want to do something with the money first." "What do you mean?" Lily explained her plan. Before the story went public, before the government could seize the assets or tie them up in legal proceedings, she wanted to set up an anonymous trust fund for disaster relief victims. She'd use Jacob's records to identify people who'd been defrauded, verify their losses, and distribute restitution directly. Sarah's eyes widened. "That's insane. The moment you start moving that money, you'll trigger every financial monitoring system in the country." "Not if we're smart about it. Jacob taught me how to move money without leaving traces. Small amounts, multiple accounts, cryptocurrency conversions. It can be done." "And if you get caught?" "Then at least some of the money made it to the people it was supposed to help." Sarah leaned back in the booth, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Your father raised you well." "He wasn't my father," Lily said softly. "Not by blood, but yeah, he did." Over the next 8 months, Lily and Sarah worked in tandem on parallel tracks. Sarah built the story, interviewing victims, verifying documents, and establishing relationships with editors at major publications who could handle a story this explosive. Meanwhile, Lily became a ghost in the financial system. She converted portions of the physical cash into cryptocurrency, which she then moved through dozens of digital wallets before converting it back into dollars deposited in accounts she'd set up for specific victims. A $10,000 payment to Maria Rodriguez for home repairs she'd never been able to afford. $25,000 to the Westerfield family to finally pay off the loans they'd taken out 20 years ago. $30,000 to Daniel Kim, now in his 40s and still struggling, to help him start the business he'd always dreamed of. Each payment came with a simple note. "This money was stolen from you in the disaster relief fraud of 1998 through 2003. It is being returned to you anonymously by someone who believes justice delayed should not mean justice denied." The recipients didn't understand at first. Some thought it was a scam. Others reported it to the authorities, who investigated and found nothing illegal, just money moving from legitimate accounts to people who were owed far more than they received. Lily moved carefully, never more than a few million at a time, spreading the distributions over months to avoid triggering automated alerts. By the time Sarah was ready to publish, Lily had returned over $30 million to more than 200 families. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. On a Tuesday morning in October, Sarah Chen's story broke across 3 platforms simultaneously: her own investigative journalism site, a major newspaper, and a primetime news magazine. The headline read, "The Clearwater Conspiracy: How Government Officials Stole $280 million from Disaster Victims." The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the story was trending on every social media platform. News networks scrambled to confirm the details, pulling Sarah into interview after interview. The documents she'd published were downloaded millions of times. Names that had once been powerful and respected were suddenly toxic. By the end of the week, 3 senators had resigned. A former FEMA administrator was arrested. The Justice Department announced a full investigation. State attorneys general began opening their own inquiries into local officials mentioned in the report. But the most powerful part of the story wasn't the corruption, it was the victims. Sarah had interviewed dozens of them, and their faces filled the screen during every news segment, every documentary, every podcast episode that covered the scandal. They told their stories with quiet dignity: homes they couldn't rebuild, children who couldn't go to college, retirements that never happened, dreams that died because the help they'd been promised was stolen by people they'd trusted. And then they told another story, about anonymous payments that had arrived in recent months, about money that came from nowhere to help them finally recover from losses they'd suffered decades ago. The authorities tried to trace the payments. They failed. Lily had been too careful, too thorough. The money had disappeared into the legitimate economy, impossible to claw back even if they'd wanted to. The media went wild trying to identify the source. They called it the Clearwater Angel, the Anonymous Avenger, Robin Hood of the Rockies. Theories exploded across the internet. Some thought it was a whistleblower inside the government. Others believed it was a hacking collective. A few even speculated it was the ghost of Jacob Hayes, the investigator who'd supposedly died 15 years ago, but whose name kept appearing in the documents. In Ridgeline, the locals watched the news with growing recognition. They remembered Jacob, the quiet man who'd lived on the mountain. They remembered Lily, the girl he'd raised. And slowly, quietly, they began to connect the dots. But when reporters came to town asking questions, the community closed ranks. The woman at the general store claimed she barely remembered Jacob. The sheriff said he'd moved away years ago. The diner owner shrugged and said mountain folk kept to themselves. Nobody mentioned Lily's name, not once. Lily watched it all unfold from the cabin, her heart pounding every time a new development broke. She'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. The truth was out, the victims were being helped, and the criminals were facing consequences. But she'd also painted a target on her back. Sarah Chen called her once, using an encrypted line. "You need to leave," she said without preamble. "The FBI is looking for the source of those payments. They're good, Lily. They might find you." "Let them," Lily said. "I didn't do anything illegal. I returned stolen money to its rightful owners." "You accessed federal evidence without authorization. You moved money that technically belongs to the government until a judge says otherwise. They can make your life very difficult." "They can try." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then laughed. "You're as stubborn as your father was." "I learned from the best." But Sarah was right to be worried. 2 weeks after the story broke, FBI agents arrived at the cabin. The same agents who'd come 5 years earlier, Cole and Martinez, looking older and wearier, but no less determined. "We know it was you," Cole said without preamble. "We know Jacob Hayes lived here under his real name. We know you were his daughter, or close enough, and we know you're the one who gave Sarah Chen that evidence." Lily sat on the porch railing, arms crossed, saying nothing. "We're not here to arrest you," Martinez added, surprising her. "We're here to say thank you." That got her attention. "What?" Cole stepped forward. 15 years ago, I was a junior agent assigned to financial crimes. I watched as the Hayes investigation was shut down, watched as evidence disappeared, watched as good agents were silenced or reassigned. I always wondered what happened to the man brave enough to expose it all. "He died," Lily said quietly, 5 years ago. Heart attack. We figured, but his work lived on, because of you. Martinez gestured to the cabin. "You finished what he started. You got justice for people who'd been forgotten. That takes guts." "It also might have broken about a dozen laws," Cole added with a slight smile. "Lucky for you, we can't prove you did anything illegal. The money movements are untraceable, and returning stolen funds to victims isn't technically a crime, even if your methods were unconventional." "So why are you here?" Lily asked. "To tell you it's over," Cole said. "The investigation is wrapping up. Indictments are coming down. The money that's left will be distributed through proper channels. And the cabin." He looked around. "It's yours. Clear title. No one's going to bother you about it." "What about Jacob's name?" Martinez smiled. "He's being posthumously cleared. The Treasury Department is issuing a statement acknowledging his service and apologizing for the way he was treated. There's even talk of naming the Victims' Compensation Fund after him." Lily felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. He would have liked that. After the agents left, Lily sat on Jacob's grave and told him everything. About the story breaking, about the arrests, about the victims finally getting help, about his name being cleared and his work being recognized. "We did it, Bear," she whispered. "It's finished." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. The investigation was finished, the story was told, justice was being served. But her work, her real work, was just beginning. Over the next 3 years, Lily transformed the cabin and the land around it. She used some of the remaining money, the portions she'd kept legally through legitimate channels Sarah had helped her establish, to build additional structures, create a proper learning center, and develop curriculum. She called it the Hayes Ridge Wilderness Academy. It wasn't a traditional school. It was a place for kids who'd been forgotten by the system. Foster children, orphans, teenagers aging out of care with nowhere to go. Lily taught them the skills Jacob had taught her: survival, self-reliance, critical thinking, resilience. But she also taught them something more important. She taught them that their past didn't define their future. That trauma could be transformed into strength. That being alone didn't mean being abandoned. The first student to arrive was a 14-year-old girl named Emma, removed from an abusive home with nowhere to go and no family willing to take her in. She showed up scared, angry, defensive, wrapped in a borrowed coat 3 sizes too big. Lily saw herself in that girl immediately. She knelt down so they were eye to eye and held out her hand. "You're safe now," Lily said gently. "Let me show you how strong you can be." Emma stared at her for a long moment, suspicious, guarded. Then slowly, hesitantly, she took Lily's hand. The academy grew. More kids came, referred by social workers, family court judges, even Sarah Chen, who'd stayed in touch and become a friend. Some stayed for months, learning skills and healing wounds. Others stayed for years, becoming part of something that felt like family. Lily taught them how to build fires, track animals, read weather patterns. She taught them math and science and literature by the light of kerosene lamps. She taught them that the strongest people weren't the ones who never fell. They were the ones who got back up. And on quiet evenings when the students were asleep and the mountain was silent, Lily would walk up to Jacob's grave and tell him about her day. About the girl who'd finally smiled for the first time in months. About the boy who'd stopped flinching when she moved too quickly. About the teenager who'd gotten accepted to college and cried because he never thought he'd make it that far. "You'd be proud of them, Bear," she'd say. "They're fighters, just like you taught me to be." The media eventually lost interest in the Clearwater scandal. New scandals emerged, new stories dominated the headlines. But for the people who'd been affected, the victims who received restitution, the families who could finally rebuild, the communities that got the help they'd been denied, the impact lasted forever. Schools were rebuilt, homes were restored, college funds were established for children who'd lost parents, medical bills were paid, businesses were started. And in a quiet ceremony in Washington, D.C., the Treasury Department established the Jacob T. Hayes Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief Integrity, ensuring that future victims would be protected from the kind of fraud he'd spent his life fighting. Lily didn't attend the ceremony. She watched it on a live stream from the cabin, surrounded by her students, and felt a complicated mix of pride and sadness. Jacob had died alone on a mountain, believing he'd failed in his mission. He never got to see the impact his work would have, never knew that his sacrifice mattered. But Lily knew, and she'd make sure no one ever forgot. On a cool evening in late September, 5 years after Sarah's story broke, Lily stood on the ridge overlooking the cabin. She was 23 years old now, no longer the frightened girl Jacob had rescued, or even the determined teenager who'd exposed the conspiracy. She'd grown into someone new, someone shaped by love and loss and purpose. The academy behind her buzzed with activity. Students were cooking dinner, doing homework, practicing wilderness skills in the clearing. Laughter echoed through the trees, and smoke curled from the chimney of the main cabin. It was alive. The mountain that had once been Jacob's hiding place, his sanctuary from a world that wanted him dead, had become something beautiful and hopeful and real. Lily heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Emma, now 17 and preparing to leave for college, standing with her arms crossed against the evening chill. "You okay?" Emma asked. "Yeah," Lily said, "just thinking. About Jacob. Always." Emma moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out over the valley below. "Do you think he'd be proud of what you've done here?" Lily smiled. "I think he'd tell me I was being too soft, that survival isn't about comfort. Then he'd probably help me build another cabin and teach all of you how to properly split firewood." Emma laughed. "Sounds about right." She hesitated, then added, "I wrote something for my college application essay about this place, about you. Want to hear it?" "Of course." Emma pulled out her phone and read aloud. People think strength is about never breaking, but the strongest person I know broke into 1,000 pieces when she was 7 years old. She lost her parents, lost her home, lost everything. And she could have stayed broken. She could have let that tragedy define her entire life. But instead, she let a mountain man teach her how to survive. And then when he died, she took everything he'd taught her and used it to help other broken people put themselves back together. That's real strength. Not avoiding the fall, but learning to rebuild. Lily's eyes filled with tears. That's beautiful, Emma.
It's true. You saved me. Just like Jacob saved you.
He did more than save me, Lily said softly. He showed me what it meant to stand up for something bigger than yourself. To fight for justice, even when it costs you everything. To protect the people who can't protect themselves. And now you're teaching us the same thing. I'm trying. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Finally, Emma spoke again. What was the hardest part of everything you went through? Lily thought about it. She thought about the night she'd found the hidden room, the months she'd spent planning how to expose the conspiracy, the fear she'd felt waiting for Sarah's story to break. She thought about Jacob's death, about saying goodbye to the only father she'd ever really known. The hardest part, she said finally, was believing I was strong enough to finish what he started. Jacob had so much faith in me, but I wasn't sure I had faith in myself. But you did it anyway. Because the alternative was letting all those people down. The victims who'd been waiting for justice. Jacob, who'd died believing I'd keep my promise. And honestly, I was also doing it for that scared 7-year-old girl in the car wreck who thought she'd never be whole again. I wanted to prove to her that she could survive anything. Emma nodded slowly. That's why I'm going to college. Not because I'm sure I'll succeed, but because I want to prove to myself that I can. Lily pulled her into a hug. You're going to do amazing things, Emma. I know it. As Emma headed back down to help with dinner, Lily turned toward Jacob's grave one more time. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates and a single line. He stood for those who couldn't stand for themselves. We did it, Bear, Lily whispered. Not just the investigation, not just the money, but this. She gestured to the academy, to the lights glowing in the cabin windows, to the sound of young voices filled with hope. We built something that matters, something that lasts. The wind rustled through the pines, and for a moment, Lily could swear she heard Jacob's voice carried on it. That's my girl. She smiled, wiped her eyes, and walked back down the path toward the cabin. Toward the students who were waiting for her, who needed her, who were learning that strength wasn't about never falling, it was about always getting back up. Toward the life she'd built from the ashes of tragedy. Toward the legacy that wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed, in hope restored, in justice served. Because Lily Hayes had learned the most important lesson Jacob could have taught her. The greatest treasure isn't what you find or what you inherit. It's what you do with it. It's the choice you make when standing up seems impossible and the world tells you to stay down. It's the courage to say that some things matter more than safety, more than comfort, more than fear. Things like truth, like justice, like protecting the people who need protecting and standing up for those who can't stand for themselves. Jacob had given her $280 million and the evidence to expose a conspiracy. But his real gift was teaching her that the value of a life isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you give. And Lily had given everything. Anyone can inherit money, but it takes real courage to inherit a mission, to carry forward a legacy of justice, even when the cost is high and the risks are real. As the stars began to appear over Hayes Ridge that evening, Lily Hayes stood in the doorway of the cabin her father had built, surrounded by children who needed exactly what she'd once needed. Someone to believe in them, someone to teach them strength, someone to show them that broken things can be made whole again. The mountain man who took in an orphaned girl had hidden $280 million behind a false wall. But the real fortune he'd left behind wasn't money at all. It was love. It was purpose. It was the unshakable belief that one person, no matter how small or scared or alone, can change the world if they're brave enough to try. And for Lily, for her students, and for all the people whose lives were touched by Jacob's sacrifice and Lily's courage, that was worth more than all the money in the world. Because some legacies can't be measured in dollars. They're measured in lives saved, in justice served, in hope restored. And that legacy would live on forever. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of courage, justice, and unexpected discoveries. Click to continue the journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that standing up for what's right is always worth the fight.